Nous voilà après un bon café, un bon thé, quelques gâteaux à n'importe de sucre, avec de nouvelles forces pour reprendre dans cette seconde partie de l'après-midi et une communication d'Azadeh Sharifi de la Freie Universität Berlin. Cette fois-ci, c'est la bonne prononciation pour la Freie Universität. Azadeh Sharifi est professeur invité au département de théâtre de cette université libre de Berlin. Ses travaux portent sur l'histoire du théâtre post-colonial et post-migrant, sur les représentations d'artistes racialisés et sur les intersections entre race, migration et colonialité dans les représentations européennes contemporaines. Auparavant, vous avez été professeur invité, théâtre et Gastprofessor au département des langues et littératures germaniques de l'Université de Toronto et professeur invité à l'Université der Künste de Berlin. Vous êtes membre du conseil d'administration des Performance Studies International et cofondatrice du réseau Neue Kritische Theaterwissenschaft. Votre dernière publication, Theaterwissenschaft postkolonial, décolonial, éditée avec Lisa Skvilbris, pardon. Ja, Entschuldigung, a été publié chez Transcript en 2022. Das ist ein Zungenbrecher. Skvilbris. Entschuldigung.
Don't worry about it. Skvilbris is an Ukrainian name.
Ja.
Even though she's German, but and her child, she calls herself Kürbis.
Oh nein, das werde ich nie tun. Nein, Skvilbris. Entschuldigung. Sie sprechen heute, vous allez nous parler aujourd'hui de ästhetische Verhandlungen, künstlerische Verantwortung, Kolonialität auf deutschen Bühnen anhand der Performance Tsingtao Messi Archive, deutsche Kolonialgeschichte in China. Vielen Dank.
Hallo?
Ja.
Ist das an?
Ist gut. Funktioniert. Nein, jetzt nicht mehr. Sie müssen wieder drücken. Hier. Genau. Sehen Sie das?
Yes, ja.
Rote Licht?
Genau. Einen schönen Nachmittag, un bon soirée.
Bon après-midi.
Bon après-midi. Ich könnte im ich kann nicht im Elsässischen sprechen. Ich bin aufgewachsen in der Nähe und quasi mit einem odenwälderischen Dialekt, der dem Elsässischen sehr nah ist, aber ich glaube, das ist nicht die Sprache, die ich jetzt wählen werde. Ich kann es auch eigentlich nicht. So I'm gonna switch to English. I hope everyone can understand me. Yes, I prepared my presentation in English because I was hoping that I could speak to the majority of the people, but I'm also happy to share my presentation afterwards, similar to some of you who I'm asked if they are willing to share their presentations with me, because I really want to read them afterwards. Thank you so much. So my presentation is called Qingdao, a Messy Archive, Negotiating Aesthetics, Artistic Responsibility and Coloniality on German Stages. And I'm going to start by framing it in a specific way. The COVID-19 pandemic is not long over. In fact, we are still in the aftermath of recovering on a personal and social, political and governmental level from its effects. What the pandemic uncovered was not only a wave of solidarity and social empathy, but also a deep entrenched anti-Asian, or more precisely, anti-Chinese racism. As in this Deutsche Welle post, the rising anti-Asian racism was traced back to the Nazi regime, when Chinese people living in Germany were expelled or deported to concentration camps and forced into labor. But for the specific German context, there is another historical point where imperial desire and colonial aspiration has driven towards subjugated Asians, or more specifically Chinese. Qingdao, a city on the eastern shores of China, was a German colony from 1898 until the First World War, or even until the end of the First World War. While in recent years Germany has come to terms with, or at least acknowledges, its colonial past, within the African continent. The colonial history in China seems to be little known. It used to be called the Musterkolonie, blueprint colony. This is actually a historical landscape of the area Kiachu, the Kiachu Bucht, it's called. And from a installation and presentation of the Bundesarchiv, this is the historical context. This is German, but I am translating it in English. The port colony was led by a governor who was responsible for civil and military administration. The aspiration for Kiachu, with its capital Xiangtao, was to become the model colony of the German Empire through technical progress and generous expansion. It included establishing a colonial administration responsible for creating a modern infrastructure with the construction of roads, a fresh water supply system, and a functioning sewage system. However, Kiachu remained a subsidized colony. So they had all these aspirations, but due to the short time, they were not able to realize everything they planned. In the performance, where we'll show some pictures and images, some of these will be made more visible. Since neither the German nor Chinese governments seem interested in looking closer into this particular history, the theater stage has become, I would claim once again, the public space for negotiating the colonial past and its traces in contemporary theatrical and more general social contexts. The presentation examines the possibility of theaters as a public space that has the potential to engage with difficult and unresolved histories or the past through the online performance Tsingtao, a messy archive. The performance was created by Matthias Becker, Chen Tin Chen, Dora Cheng, and Lisa Zetner, and funded by the Nationaltheater Mannheim, more specifically Junges Nationaltheater Mannheim, so the youth theater of National Theater Mannheim. And this is just a image of the website. We will see more of this website. In the following, I will give a summary of the performance, as I myself have attended the premiere online in May 2020. Then I will look closely into what kind of aesthetic means the artists have chosen to present their research-based performance, which brings me to the question of artistic responsibility. And finally, I will critically interrogate coloniality as an underlying factor in German and more general European theatre. In a short conclusion, I ask about the colonial legacy of methodologies, that is, the techniques of perception and representation, and argue with Gominda Bamra for an epistemological just approach in our scholarly work. The first performance that I attended while on lockdown in 2020 was Tsingtao, a messy archive. I was contacted through Facebook by Matthias Becker, one of the performers who was at that time part of the ensemble of Junges Nationaltheater Mannheim. Although we were just two months into the pandemic, and I didn't know it would take years, I distinctly remember that I was desperate for some intellectual stimulation through artistic practices and interventions. And I was curious how artists would lead with the circumstances, especially when the theater as a space of interaction that requires presence could not provide that. But within the circumstances of a pandemic and the lockdown, performance as the enactment of collaborative practices meant for other people to witness could also mean that it didn't need to be through a physical presence. We could interact while only attending the performance online. One of the main forces that drove me towards the performance was, I have to admit, that I did not know and had not learned about German colonies in China, and was additionally anxious about the rising anti-Asian racism that more and more affected my friends and colleagues. And I was wondering how to deal not only with the symptoms, but acknowledge the roots of it. Is it? Nee. The performance premiered online at Junges Nationaltheater Mannheim on May 2, 2020, and it was conceptualized and executed by a collective of artists from Germany, China, and Taiwan. These artists were Matthias Becker, Chin Tin Chen, Dora Cheng, Hia Tzu Chin Chen, Zhang Yao Yan. I'm so sorry to butcher the names. I should have prepared more. Better in that sense. Xin Hu Zheng, Yasmina Quach, and Lisa Zedner, and Wei Zhang. I'm naming all of these performers because it's important, because they all have contributed to the performance. The performance consisted of 4 parts, officially of 4 parts. A kind of prologue. I don't know, I may have chosen the wrong color and you're not able to read it. You also don't need to read it, because I will also make it, I will tell you the context. Kind of prologue where I received an email with instructions. The email was sent by Gerd Branschke, who is the head of the Department of Theater Pedagogy at Junges Nationaltheater Mannheim, and contained a link to Zoom with a password, a reminder of the need for a computer to attend a performance, and a reminder to register under my name ahead of attendance. The email also included a schedule of how the performance was structured and how long the performance would take. Since these emails from a theater administration ahead of a performance are or were in fact unusual until the pandemic, I would clearly categorize it as part of the performance. And I have some thoughts on these specific instructions regarding this particular performance, which I will come back to later when talking about coloniality. Part 1, after the prologue, of the performance was gathering at Zoom, being welcomed by the performers, who through personal and political facts and experience created a mise en scène for the audience. The first part was rather short, between 5 to 10 minutes. It gave some hints and information, but did not contextualize the performance itself, or the material they had. I will show you the trailer of the performance now, and I don't think that will work. No, it does. Sorry. Now I need to, yeah, this is gonna work. It is not working.
Hallo Leute, ich bin Zhen Hao. Willkommen.
Hi， 大家好，我是陈婷，欢迎来到我们这个混乱的档案馆。
Hi, ich bin Matthias. Herzlich willkommen zu Qingdao, a messy archive.
Allow me shortly introduce you guys what is Qingdao today, because 120 years ago it was a German colony. Prost! Lecker! Qingdao-Bier, ist richtig gut. Sag mal, do you know guys how far from Qingdao to Mannheim? Ich zeig euch. But sometimes, just sometimes, when you on your way, you just get lost. Yeah. Get lost.
Sorry, I was hoping to project it in more bigger way, but yeah, you saw this was basically a kind of compilation and the trailer for the performance. The second part of the performance consisted of getting access to the website. So we started by gathering on Zoom, being introduced and welcomed by the performers. Part of it you saw right now, and then we got we had around 40 minutes to read, look, and click through the performance. I will navigate you a little bit through this performance, through the website. So this is the starting, or the first page of the website. It says, "Welcome, you're entering the Messy Archive. These are 5 levels and 24 rooms in our archives. Look out for 20 doors. In total on these levels, no worries and no pressure. You will not be able to read here and look on everything. The stories are complex, the wordings are ambiguous, and the perspectives are varied. Go with the flow and find your own angle." So you had 40 minutes, and then you were trying to click on, for example, this is, where is it? What is it? What are you doing? Go away. So you entered it says Eingangshalle, entrance room, and then there is, for example, some thoughts on an archive as an onion, and then you scroll through this page, go through and find information, and there is this clip of an onion. I hope it shows. And illustrates how they imagined. Then, again, there you can click through some of the thoughts on archives, some of the material they were gathering, but you also have the possibility to enter the other rooms, which are organized in their first research trip, their second research trip to Tsingtao, their first conceptual meeting as an artist group in, is it Berlin? Yeah. That was still in person. Then they started doing a so-called Bauprobe. I don't know what the English word for that is. Building the mise en scène. Doing a workshop, and then here, these are testimonies of the pandemic, and again, recreating the performance. And again, you can click on, oops, why isn't it not working? You can click through these, through all these kind of special trips or the meetings. You can get some information about the meetings. So it's complex. You might get lost, as I was trying to do, and you have some ideas what were going on, right? So you can scroll up and down, right and left, and there is more information. So we had part 1 and part 2, and part 3 consisted of electronic music by Yasmina Quat, who you've seen in the trailer, a short period where they were performing music they do, which then faded into a gathering for those who wanted to stay after the official end of the performance. And as a kind of epilogue, at least for me, the performance also included, let me go back to my, as a kind of epilogue, at least for me, the performance also included part 5, where I met the performance 2 weeks later in another Zoom meeting to discuss the conditions of performance and production. This conversation included Dora Cheng, Matthias Becker, Lisa Zentner, and Zhao Yang. That was the performer who was drinking beer, just to give you some names to the faces, and lasted 50 minutes. And I will use some of the recordings also here so you can listen to it. We talked about how the performance came to place, what kind of obstacles the performers had, especially for the performers who were confronted through the pandemic with more structural difficulties like visa and traveling issues, and so on. This is a little bit of the setting of the performance. Before I dive into the performance analysis, I will spell out my situated knowledge for this specific performance. I do this because, in the end, I will argue again that while engaging with theater and performance, there is no neutral or universal position, not even as scholars. This universalism is part of the colonial legacy, which we need to unlearn. As I have argued with my colleague Lisa Squeerblies, oder Kürbis. No, sorry, it's not fair to do this. She's a dear friend of mine. Lisa Squeerblies. Race as a social category needs to be incorporated into our analysis as it configures and structures our perception. I position myself within the audience as a racialized woman who has not only lived experience in through epistemic violence on a personal and institutional level, but also comes from the field that is the discipline and practice of theater and performance studies, with a specific lens of post-colonial theory and decolonial option. My position allows me to use double consciousness, to quote W.E.B. Du Bois, as a personal and a theoretical tool to challenge a hegemonic perception and to interact with it as a historical and not natural conception. This means, while I myself might be triggered by aspects of the performance, I am also able to read and perceive the clues of racialized violence trauma, which I then can contextualize and historicize within artistic, activist, and academic context. But I'm also aware of the position I'm taking as a scholar that seems to speak and interpret and contextualize knowledge production of subaltern subjects. To speak with Spivak, and that is a quote, is it possible to imagine as the subject of ethics, that is to say, the human beings who thinks of doing the right thing and therefore is capable of doing the wrong thing for the other person? How is it possible to think such a subject outside of the monotheist Judeo-Christian tradition and its critique, quote end. Keeping this in mind, I'm going to the analysis of the performance. In the following, I identify those aesthetic means that have been used in a performance not only to present a story, but actually to complicate its history, one that is colonial and seems to be swept under the carpet. This research-based performance has research as a starting point, and I argue that this is necessary to engage with a specific material and data as it is focusing on, mainly the colonial past of the city of Tsingtao. As in the interview I conducted with the artist 2 weeks later, the artist worked on the project for more than a year. They did 2 research trips together as a team. The first trip was in March 2018, which had the underlying question of how the German colonial past in Tsingtao was narrated, represented, and processed. To quote the artist, the questions we were confronted with were, who writes history from which perspective? What does rehabilitation mean and in which context? They met with a while on this trip, they met with a film club consisting of filmmakers and documentary and fiction. They also met with performers in a shadow theater who gave them a workshop. They described the trip as crucial to understanding how different institutions in the city deal with the topic of German colonialism. To quote again the artist, although the word colonialism rarely appears, overall it can be said that the topic is a sensitive issue of Tsingtao and China. In conversations with local artists, we were able to get a deeper insight into the past. Some of the German houses in Tsingtao, and unfortunately I forgot to include, I realize, one of the images, because it looks very German. You can Google it if you want. Some of the houses in Tsingtao from 120 years ago have been extensively renovated and have become tourist attractions. Here, a very positive image of the German past in China is drawn. On the other hand, you can find many other original buildings in the city center which are still unrefurbished. Quote end. The second trip in July 2019 was essential for the artistic group themselves. While doing a shadow theater workshop with Cindy Choi, I think I have an image of that, and visiting an important location of Taoist beliefs, they visited numerous museums and public places and walked together through the city and engaged with its multi-layered history. Here I quote again the artists themselves. For example, the Japanese occupation was perceived much more negatively than the German occupation in Tsingtao. This did not only become visible during the guided tours, but also in the exhibition we visited. Why is it seen like that? How did the presence of the German become a positive event? Why is it the conception of colonialism not shaped, used, reflected? From which perspective is history recorded and archived? These are important questions that arouse from our tangible encounters. Within the whole experience, it should not be forgotten that especially the encounter of the artistic team on non-German ground contained a reversal of the dominance of the German territory. So this is their description of how this position of visiting becomes a question of a hierarchy, which I think still needs to be questioned further, because as we have already talked, who's able to travel and who's not. The research they conducted for the performance questions a hegemonic understanding of these particular events. They looked beyond that and took a self-examination of what material could be important. They have chosen artistic approaches to understand what is perceived as tradition. They have decided against looking into colonial archives, which is, as a scholar, I would say, necessary to understand the colonial administration, presentation, and representation. But I would argue with Laura Stoller that the artists have in fact moved from so-called, I quote Stoller, archives as sources to archives as subject. The artists have created an archive of their own, and that is the testimony you've seen on the website, which is another aesthetic means that I would like to highlight. The archive website contains a combination of historical and personal documents, images and videos of Tsingtao. Again, I will share the link of the website with you and you can click through that. There's not enough time for that right now. The website does not follow a chronological order and resist the colonial idea of naming, claiming and reducing subjects, items, places and traditions to objects of catalogues and categories. Here, a non-chronological chronology of documents and the representation of history as messy, which Oxford Dictionary defines as so-called dirty, unpleasant, or lacking order, and or a messy situation is one that is confused and unpleasant, quote end, enables the performance to not present Hegelian dialectic to its spectators. The messiness of the archives forces the audience to go back and forth, scroll up and down, and switch between the pages and the languages which are used. So if you have looked closer, you will see that they are using at least 3 languages, German, English, and Mandarin. It demands we look beyond the Eurocentric gaze, even those of us, by that I mean myself, claiming to question a Eurocentric and therefore colonial norm, as it also documents how China, or to be more precise, the representatives of the city of Tsingtao, prefer not to withhold the violence of the colonial history and emphasize the positive aspect of the period of German colonial rule. The conversations becomes more constricted through the critical perspective of the Taiwanese performers and their experience of the Chinese rule over Taiwan and its ongoing suppression. This is something that has been also mentioned within the performance, but also, again, was taken up by during the interview I did with the performance themselves. So they highlighted these aspects within the performance for the audience, but also went deeper into the conversation while we had it on a private, academic, artistic level. The conversation the archive that is created is a testimony of trial and error. It does not claim to represent a whole and rounded history, but a personal and institutional, since the Junges Nationaltheater Mannheim was involved, of coming to terms with what administrative and epistemic violence are produced and reproduced. Another important factor in questioning hierarchy and power dynamics in the performance is how they have started and reflected the process of their collaboration. Since the production was funded and therefore also based in a German institution, those power dynamics played an important role in the relationship between the artists. They described is there another? No, that comes. Since the production was funded and therefore also based in a German institution, those power dynamics played an important role in the relationship between the artists. They describe the collaboration themselves in the following messy, aka complicated way. And I quote here, "This turns out to be a fundamental base for the cooperation amongst the artistic team. The security of all participants to operate with confidence in their respective theatrical system and artistic and linguistic context was lifted and everyone experienced alienation. The fact that of the permanent situation of translation also led to decisive insight into the context of the actual artistic project and the question of perspectives of translation, interpretation, and the dominance of those people who decided which knowledge will be shared by which facts. These particular moments of excessive demands and confusion became the background for our exploration of colonialism and the directly related question of racism and stereotypes." And I want to emphasize that the performance uses the personal experience of the performance as lived experience, that is subjugated knowledges in the Foucauldian sense, as they normally do not count as informants of the hegemonic history that is structured by official documents and memorandums. The performers do not use, or better, abuse the native, the subaltern, to force them to speak, as we have seen in the presentation before, to a predominantly white audience, which in a sense is not only perpetuating colonial violence but consolidating colonial power. The lived experience is multi-layered and the performers approach it from a black feminist tool that is intersectionality. It is not only the social construction of race, but also gender, disability, and other dimensions of heteronormativity that play a crucial role in defining the lived experience. By using these tools of deconstructing and layering open the interrelational dynamics of the performers among themselves to institutions, social, cultural, and political, that is governmental, and to the audience. By not alleviating and whitewashing the complicated and messiness of the dynamics, which is not only coming from personal capacities and incapacities, but from a long colonial system of privilege and deprivileging, the artists are able to find a common ground that constantly needs to be negotiated within these relationships. Here I'm leaving the aesthetics of the performance and looking closer into the ethics and responsibilities of the performance when conducted between a so-called international artistic team funded by a German institution. And I use international with a question mark and also quotes, since it identifies the relationship from a nationalistic or ethno-nationalistic foundation and not so much from a complex historical background where some of the performers experience discrimination and exclusion within the nation's bound. So, for example, racialized subjects within the German context are still perceived as the other and are positioned outside of Germany and stuff like that. I am highlighting that because we sometimes tend to take highly loaded political terms and zip them over our research subjects and objects, never asking ourselves if this is appropriate, if this is what the subjects themselves would want to be identified with, or if the context we are using it would rather need a more nuanced description. The performance was initially inspired actually by Matthias Becker, who researched German colonialism and especially in Namibia, and then by accident was confronted with Germany's colonial past in China or Kiatu. The region which was called. They wondered why they did not know anything about this part of German history. This is how their own account of how the engagement with this particular topic started in the interview I did with them 2 weeks after the performance. While on a residency in Beijing, they started collaborating with Chen Ten, and I will play you parts of the interview where Chen Ten is positioning that within a context.
I can talk from my perspective. I think the first time we meet each other, me and Matthias, was an online meeting as well. And at that time, I was in Beijing. I worked in Beijing for a while last year. I think during the summertime, right, August thing. And then I think we made our contact at that time when I was in Beijing writing a film for local company. So I think basically, when Matthias told me about the whole project, I feel how do I how do I put that? I think I feel very much surprised that someone in Germany would be interested in such kind of subject, because even in our own education in China, we ignore the history of, let's say, colonialism very often, and I think the research is I think the research in China and in Europe, let's say Europe, because I think it might be more appropriate. So I think the research in China and research in Europe about colonialism in China and in Asian countries are very different. I think the perspectives are very different.
Okay, I will stop here. Did I stop? No. It is on the one hand the curiosity and maybe on a personal level furiousness, anger, sadness of being shielded from German colonial atrocities. That is the perspective of Matthias Becker. While on the other hand, it is the astonishment and maybe also on a personal startledness with interest that was not expected. And while often when confronted with the colonial past, especially one that seems to be so controversial, the hegemonic spectators, to quote Diana Taylor, profit from the non-identification. Here, the coloniality of the structures, the inequality between the stories, histories, and the way it has been narrated was further complicated by the current experience of the Chinese and Taiwanese performers with anti-racism, that is they're talking about then afterwards, that has emerged with the rise of the global pandemic. Tsingtao does not give simple answers within its research, nor does it make it easy and comfortable for the audiences. The colonizer and colonized can be embodied by the same subject or entirety, state, government, or people, but what it emphasizes or forces the audience to acknowledge is the colonial legacy that still rules history, the narration of history, and its ongoing performative embodiment. But the coloniality of German theater is one that cannot not be easily undermined and levered out. Looking closer at who remains responsible for the performance, which is the German team coming from the Junges Nationaltheater Mannheim, cannot be disregarded. Who has the rights to define the production and presentation, terms and conditions, who is paid in which way and can in the literal sense make a career out of it, this artistic project, and who might be confronted through this artistic project by governmental harassment, that is visa and traveling permissions, as well as governmental repressions, as well as being confronted by a predominantly white audience that maybe even inadvertently creates a hierarchy within the artistic group, and who views some of the performers as racialized subjects, are only some of the aspects of coloniality of German theater, which German theater contains. So I come to the closing points. Did I? No, it's not going to work. Here. I want to conclude not so much by what we, the audience, and here I'm talking about the audience of the performance, but also you as the academic audience listening to my talk, have learned and gained from the performance, but rather what it means to conduct research within a still stable Western hegemony of scholarship. How do we not fall into the trap of repeating the universal representation of the informed Western scholar who constantly produces knowledge about the world and especially the other? In my recent publication with Lisa Squiablis, we are calling German theater and performance studies a colonial discipline that needs to be decentered by looking over its epistemological borders of theory and methodology. We argue that race as a category does not only need to be included in the artistic work of institutions, like many racialized artists and their informed allies are already practicing, but also has to be the basis of how we approach academic classrooms and conduct research. Race, and let me spell it out once again, in this room we're naming, categorizing, and therefore using colonial power, has been intentionally and unintentionally used for especially those in a European context who are perceived as the other, the racialized and migranticized, against those who never have to question their race and remained the invisible norm, what Fatima El-Khatib has been called the raceless Europe. Authority is always perceived in a stabilizing way of the unquestioned own. Race as a category needs to be used as critical white studies have suggested as a post-colonial, in timely sense, tool to dismantle positionality, power dynamics, and hierarchy. As I have tried to demonstrate in my presentation today, the negotiations needs to start with our own perceptions of our own roles within these discourses and how we destabilize the colonial matrix of power in the sense Walter Mignolo has suggested. I have tried and completely failed. I have practiced and questioned what I have been trained as a Western, although racialized scholar. However, I tried to create a scholarly and artistic landscape that might allow us to use the negotiations to go beyond the center of our discipline. With that, I thank you for listening to my talk.
Vielen Dank für diesen reichen Vortrag, der am Ende wie ein Appell klingt an die Theaterwissenschaftler sowie an alle überhaupt, die sich mit Theater, fürs Theater also beschäftigen und interessieren. Also, Fragen. Emanuel.
Ja, vielen Dank für den hochspannenden Vortrag. Ich habe eine Frage zur Begriffsbezeichnung. Sie sprechen von einer Performance. Hat das damit zu tun, dass dieses Zoom-Meeting und diese Webseite nur zu bestimmten Uhrzeiten abrufbar war oder zugänglich war? Das wäre der erste Punkt. Und ich wollte dann wissen, ob so eine Art Nachleben geplant ist für diese Produktion, die dann zu einer Webdokumentation werden würde. Und das wäre auch interessant, weil dadurch könnte sie auch Part oder Teil eines Archivs meine Fragen.
Ja. Soll ich auf Deutsch oder auf Englisch?
En anglais ou en allemand?
En allemand. En allemand.
Non, alors en anglais.
Anglais? Okay. So I call it specifically a performance because you had to buy a ticket. It wasn't for free. You got access at a specific time. I used this specific email that you see here. Can't read, but yeah, there's an email. And there was I don't know the exact number, but I think there was 5 to 10 performances, presentation shows. And it was taken up by Nachtkritik as one of the important performances in 2020 and was highlighted by Nachtkritik as a theater critic website. But after that, this was a unique performance that did not take over. So all the material that I have used, besides the trailer, are those that artists graciously gave me for my research. It is not. I think it's not. The website is not publicly accessible. Only when you know it. I think. I mean, I think it is publicly accessible if you have access to it in terms of knowing that it exists. But unfortunately, as you were saying, this is what I'm trying to use or make visible. That because I think this kind of documenting the how the research led to this performance, how they had to switch, and basically, and I didn't go into details about it, how actually the online presentation made it even more able for those who were not so within in the interview I did conducted afterwards with them. They told me how difficult it was for them to move during the lockdown. I think some of them were back in China, some of them were in other places where they had artistic research, artistic residencies. Some were trapped because of visa conditions. And this online situation made it possible for them to present their work, and I think that was very specific. But also, I think the website and the material that is accessible in 3 languages was one of the attempts to make this messiness of their work, to make the complications of it visible. And again, I myself was not able to look or click through all the 24 rooms while during the performance.
Thank you so much. I've just a small question concerning a part of the opening.
Mm-hmm.
There was the starting point with the beer, Tsingtao beer.
Yeah.
And was it just to connect to a German audience, just a means to do so? Or is there a deeper history behind it? We all know Tsingtao beer, but I don't know anything about the sources of the production of beer in this Chinese region. And so this is just an example which leads me to a more general question. What happens if you try a contrapuntal lecture of this performance?
So this is my fault because I forgot to include, because I could have gone a little bit more into details. So part of the performance is to talk about that while Tsingtao became a Musterkolonie, the Germans set up a brewery with a standard that now is the Tsingtao beer brewery, right? So this is the connection. That the history is a colonial history of creating beer, or German beer craftsmen, that is now part of contemporary global identification with China. So this is the they're talking about it, but it's my fault that I did not do the. But again, it is so also very interesting because this is something we don't know about. This is not our common knowledge about the past. How this has and I think that's why I mentioned that, because I feel in the past 10 years there has been some public debates and discussions around colonial legacies within the African continent, specifically Namibia, the genocide on the Herero and Nama. But ask anyone about the Chinese colonies and we're like, what? We don't know it. Or the specific colony, yeah. And what was your second question?
The contrapuntal lecture with the side, kontrapunktische Lektüre, to ask the histories of things that appear in this performance.
So I think trying to that's because it's such a rich performance. I was not able to go into these layers and question also those kind of histories that I have chosen and look closer into, again, what kind of contrapunctual perspectives we could look closer into it. But I think exactly this is something that we as scholars are obliged to do and question these kind of because at the end, it still presents some material, some history, and creates a history and historicizes it or contextualizes it. And on the one hand, we do somehow have the colonial archives. They did not look into. They had one. I think they went to the Mannheim Archiv, but it's not a really like. It's not the Bundesarchiv, for example, or this is not a specific colonial archive. But yeah, looking into the material, it's a very artistic approach of a very personal approach, I would say, and then also being aware of the colonial context. While it would have been very interesting to look closer into the colonial archives, look closer into what are these kind of histories that are produced, and then look beyond it, along the what Stoller would call along the colonial archive, right? So this would be the next step that I would need to take, like me as a scholar, I think. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I was wondering, because in the last days we've repeatedly referred to co-presence and the role it plays in the questions we ask ourselves about rooms or spaces and other spaces. So I'm wondering how that is here in this online context, and how maybe what the role of the audience is, because as you also mentioned, and also as we can read in that email, there were these live moments, but then you were actually uncovering an archive. So that's a very different reception, of course. And I'm wondering, if I compare this to my experience of other works online, whether there was any notion of intimacy, or also maybe how you were aware of the other audience members or participants, or however. So I was wondering if you could say more about that in relation to the questions that interest you and the arguments you made.
Yeah. So you're absolutely right. I think this was one of so I will from a very personal experience, I would say that this was the aspect where I think they did not have enough time to think it through, and maybe because it was the beginning of the pandemic, and they had to within the 2 months restructure. So there was no you were basically aware of the others as we were during the pandemic, that there are like this black Kästchen, what is it called? I'm sorry. Boxes. But boxes, you're right. The black boxes, but there was no interaction. And I also felt at some point it was very confrontal, so it wasn't an interaction with the audience, but rather we welcome to this space that we created. Now you have access to this, and come back and listen to what we're saying and what you're presenting, and this is. And again, they chose a non-chronological, non-narrative way. Things were put together, so it completely, in that sense, makes sense. But I think for a classical trained audience, that was not trained at that time. Again, to watch online performances, this was really something very difficult to attend, because they were left alone, and it felt more like a lecture performance than a interactive co-presence performance. Again, because that's why I included it as an epilogue. I did an interview. It became a different kind of. There was another intimacy. So I myself created that as this kind of performance, but actually it wasn't. So it was maybe perceived by others in a different way. And then again, I think when you question that, I wonder, with all these questions that I raised about coloniality, about race, I'm not so sure that the way maybe a not so trained and not informed audience was overwhelmed. Maybe I would imagine that it was overwhelmed, while I would say for those that's an informed, because trained spectator, it was something that I could deal with, that I could handle. So there's definitely these kind of different positions within.
Sie hatten auch eine Frage.
Yeah, thank you so much. You mentioned the institutional conditions of production, so that questions of visa and possibility of traveling and also payment. Maybe you could go a bit deeper into that. So, who was part of Junges Theater Mannheim? How did it all how did they form as a group, and where exactly were the different positions within this institution? And we talked about the audience. I just wondered, who was the intended audience after all? Because I mean, it's a website that you can have access to if you know it, but to know it, I guess you need to know it. So how did you whom did they speak to? Also on the language basis, language level. I think it was Chinese, German, and English probably.
So yeah, who was the intended audience, more or less? And a third little question, small question. This music part in the end, like the third part of the performance, what was like what did it contribute to the whole performance? So what, maybe you can speak about that as well. Thank you.
Thank you for these questions. The two Germans, so going back here, you will see, are they named as well? No, I have to go back here in the performance. Yeah, here. Yes. Decker, Chen, Cheng, and Zedner. These are the four who collaborated on an artistic level with each other. Everyone was, then the bigger artistic group was, came in. Some were part of the production team at Junges Theater Mannheim, and the rest were guests. Within this 4-people group, Lisa Zedner is part of the Junges festes Mitglied, so she's part of the Junges Nationaltheater Mannheim. Matthias was at that time had a contract for 1 or 2 years, something like that, or had just been associated director, Hausregisseur at that time for Junges Theater. So this was their positions. The others were guests. So all the connections came through Matthias. Matthias was in contact. So Matthias and